Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series brought to you by the Environmental Law Center here at Vermont Law School. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs. I'm going to bring up a list of resources on the screen to direct you to some of the great programs at the Environmental Law Center for those of you looking to learn more. You can also view our full Hot Topics lineup by going to the website vermontlaw.edu/hot-topics. Each of these talks is worth 1 Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records if you intend to get CLE credit. There will be time for Q&A after today's presentation, so please type your question in the chat box at any point during the lecture, and we will get to as many as we can in the remaining time. Today's talk is going to end at 12:50 because our speaker needs to get to class for 1 o'clock, so we will start questions at about 12:40. Today, we are so pleased to welcome Professor Jonathan Rosenbloom. Jonathan Rosenbloom is a professor of law here at Vermont Law School and specializes in land use, climate change, and local sustainability. He received his bachelor's in architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, his JD from New York Law School, and his LLM from Harvard Law School. Prior to teaching, he founded a nonprofit that worked with state and local governments on becoming more sustainable. He clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Barquette on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, and he worked for the law firm Reed Smith. He was named the Stevens Faculty Scholar of the Year in 2018, the Distinguished Environmental Law Scholar at Vermont Law School in 2017, the Distinguished Visitor at University of Oregon School of Law in 2016, and Drake Law Outstanding Professor of the Year in 2013. He's also the co-author of 2 books, Resilience and Sustainability from Theory to Practice, and Land Use and Sustainable Development Law, Cases and Materials. His scholarship has been published in many journals, including Hastings Law Journal, Harvard Environmental Law Review, Colorado University Law Review, Washington Law Review, and many others. Most importantly, Jonathan is director of the Sustainable Development Code, a model land use code designed to provide local governments with the best sustainability practices in land use. And this is an excellent resource that I recommend you take a look at if you haven't already. Today, Professor Rosenbloom will present a talk called The Sustainable Development Code, Helping Local Governments Build Resilience and Adapt to Uncertainty. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosenbloom.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Jenny, Ann, Courtney, and the whole ELC crew for putting together the Hot Topics series and for giving me an opportunity to be a part of it. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. Local governments and communities across the United States are facing an unprecedented and uncertain time of change. They're being stressed and tested by coronavirus, political and social unrest following decades of explicit and implicit racial discrimination, a federal government unwilling and or unable to help, and other challenges like climate change and budgetary shortfalls that were already putting great stress on communities. And so in many ways, this moment and these challenges that local governments are facing are exactly what the Sustainable Development Code was designed to help address. To get some sense of the Sustainable Development Code, what I'll call the SDC today, but to get some sense of the Sustainable Development Code, what it is, how to use it, and how it can help respond to rapid changes as they're occurring, we're going to really hone in on some of the land use and development challenges that are facing communities. So we'll look at those first, and then we'll turn to the code itself and dive into some of the stuff. But this conversation on land use and development challenges can start in many different places. In order to stay ahead of the curve and think not just about today or tomorrow or next week or the next year, but to really think about what do we want for our communities in the next 10, 20, 30 years. I'm going to begin with a conversation, a short one, on projected population increases and associated development patterns stemming out of that. And we'll see how that then begins to unfold into a whole variety of issues. But so if we look at population in the United States, estimates are that the US population will increase by 50 to 75 million by 2040. And I suppose I should pause for just a moment here and make sure you're seeing the slides okay. Make sure I didn't do anything wrong. Okay, great. All right. So this kind of population growth is going to require a massive amount of development. This kind of development is going to rival what we saw post-World War II. We're looking at 90 billion additional square feet of commercial, retail, and industrial space. It's going to require nearly one half of all residential housing units to be new by 2040 as well. Well, that's going to have significant impacts on the landscape, both in terms of its environmental impacts and societal impacts, particularly if we develop under existing land use controls. So if we ran this kind of development population, this kind of development necessary to accommodate this population under existing land use controls, we see at least two impacts. The first is, pursuant to existing development codes, land consumption would outpace population, or is already outpacing population, by 30 to 50%. That means we're growing out much faster than the population is increasing. So if we just look at the low end of that increasing out, 30%, 40 million undeveloped acres will be destroyed to accommodate the new construction. Those are green fields that will be taken offline. So all the associated ecosystem services benefits that come with green fields, such as mitigating flooding, mitigating climate change, air pollution control, water pollution, soil retention, all those benefits will be taken offline. The green fields that we're talking about with 40 million undeveloped acres coming off is about the size of New York and Vermont combined. So one impact of developing under existing controls is we're going to go out and we're going to have increased impacts on the environment. And the other is that if we develop under the existing codes, we will continue and we will exacerbate systemic inequality and racial injustice that we have seen across the board in land use controls. We're going to see environmental justice issues, climate justice issues, spatial justice concerns continue to be exacerbated. Individuals of color are more likely to be struck and killed by cars because of inefficient and insufficient pedestrian mobility issues. Food deserts are riddled throughout minority neighborhoods, food swamps where we're seeing poor nutrition in these neighborhoods. Hazardous waste sites are cited in many of these neighborhoods, lack of healthcare facilities, and all sorts of other land use controls that are exacerbating some of the racial injustice concerns that have been in the news quite a bit in the last 2 weeks. In addition, we're seeing discrimination based on takings, where land use controls are being used to essentially undermine cultural and historical neighborhoods. In addition to all of that, through land use controls, we're seeing poor or no infrastructure for critical services. So here we're looking at lack of water facilities, lack of sewer facilities. We see this in Flint, in Detroit, where Detroit still has hundreds of thousands of homes, over 100,000 homes rather, still without running water. At the bottom of your screen, I have a quote here from a report out of 2019 called Broken Homes. It was reviewing mid-sized cities in Illinois. And one of the conclusions it made was the most powerful method local governments have used in segregation in mid-sized cities is land use regulation, zoning regulations, housing subsidies, tax incentives, public housing policy, and restricted covenants. Again, the idea is that if we are having this population boom and we're having this development boom, if we use the existing codes, we are simply going to exacerbate the inequalities we already have in many of our cities. And to highlight this question of poor or no infrastructure for critical services, the second to last bullet point on this slide, is that we already have an extremely vulnerable infrastructure system. I have on the board just two quotes from some national reviews of infrastructure in the country. They essentially say the same thing, and the quote from the first bullet point there sufficiently captures it, and that's that the nation's infrastructure suffers from chronic underinvestment, system failures, and service shortfalls. The second report that is quoted in the slide that you have on your screen also indicated that there were 250,000 water main breaks in 2017. Tens of thousands of incidents of combined sewage outfalls in that year as well. So we have this growth coming. We have a dilapidated infrastructure system. The growth is already sort of locked us into certain environmental and social inequalities. Overlaying that is we have significant uncertainty across a number of environmental and ecological issues. So, for example, coronavirus. Coronavirus is raising a very significant issue that already many local governments were experiencing, and that was over-retailed space. Prior to coronavirus, there were indications that we were 20 to 25% over-retailed space in the United States. Well, coronavirus is really highlighting that. And so what are our communities going to look like a year from now when we have a significantly more vacant retail space? In addition, precipitation whiplash. This is the idea that we are experiencing in some communities droughts that are followed by flooding, that are followed by droughts, that may be followed by wildfires. Autonomous vehicles are altering the way that we think about land use in many communities as well. And so thinking about how to respond to that. Consumption patterns, malnutrition, and at the same time we're seeing malnutrition, we're also seeing obesity rates on the rise. These are all uncertainties that local governments were already strained and stretched with and trying to struggle with. And I'll overlay all of this with one more thing, and that is budgets and resources. So coronavirus obviously is having significant impacts on revenue at the local level. State and local governments at this point are projecting about a $750 billion deficit coming out of this. At this point, only 36 of the 39,000 local governments across the country have received COVID funding. And those 36 all had a population of over 500,000 as part of the requirement to enter into that. So cities like Miami or Kansas City, which are not 500,000, but are significant cities, as is every city, but is significant in size, is not receiving any COVID funding, taking a significant hit to its budget nonetheless. Comparisons in terms of revenue are to the Great Recession. I have on the screen in the upper right a chart from the Great Recession indicating the tax revenue dip. And you can see in this graded shaded area, the gray shaded area from 2008, 2009, the significant drop in tax revenue for state and local governments. Well, as that continues to drop, local governments are going to continue to find that they are straining their resources. And so do they really have the resources to respond to all of the things that we just talked about in terms of environmental impacts, societal impacts, having outdated codes that need updates? And again, that's really where the Sustainable Development Code comes in. And so the Sustainable Development Code presents best practices to increase sustainability across the development code and the development process. And so working with lawyers, planners, architects, economists, city staff from across the country, both in academia and in practitioners, we try to provide the most thorough research and recommendations to assist local governments and provide them with the information they need as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. Importantly, the Sustainable Development Code, which I'll walk through in just a moment, is really an attempt to kind of plug these gaps, kind of as uncertainty or as challenges are coming down the pipe, to be able to address those and provide information to local governments very quickly so that they can adapt. There's two basic ways to search the Sustainable Development Code. The first and the second, beginning by going to our website, which is sustainablecitycode.org. That's up on the top part of your screen. I am going to work through a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. These are mostly slides that were captured from the website. So the website should look more or less like what you'll see on your screen. But the website is sustainablecitycode.org, and there's two ways to search it. One is a word search, which is right up here in the center of the screen. And the second, which we're finding through our Google Analytics to be the most popular way to search the site, is not sure where to begin. Start here. The idea is that many communities know they're facing a challenge, and they also know that potentially they want to think about this long term. They want to think about environmental impacts, economic impacts, societal impacts. And in order to do so, this is a broader way for them to explore what's on the code. So not sure where to begin starts here, pulls up a menu. And the menu begins with what's challenging your community. And it provides 32 different options. These are our sub-chapters or our chapters that we have in the code. And there are 32 of them. The idea behind these was, as I said, to be a menu for local governments to come and say, what are you seeing in your community and how can we help? So I'm going to walk through the 32 chapters, the 32 subchapters. Chapter 1, which has 7 chapters, is on your screen now, is all about the kind of classic environmental issues. So climate change, wildlife habitat, water quality and conservation, waste, urban forestry, and vegetation. Chapter 2 is all about resiliency and adaptation. So here we're looking at floodplains, wildfires, coastal hazards, steep slopes, and hazard mitigation resilience. Chapter 3, for those of you who are familiar with land use, these will look more familiar to you. These are kind of our core land use structures here and community character. Here we have 6. There are infill, development densities, mixed use, transit-oriented development, historic preservation, and parking. Chapter 4 is all about mobility. And so again, you can see the different way to think about development, that we are looking through this. We're looking at development through the lens of mobility, for example. So here, complete streets, safe streets, making sure that people can move and travel. I mentioned earlier, the statistics indicate that individuals of color are more likely to be struck and killed by vehicles. So safe streets, one of our chapters here, bicycle mobility, pedestrian mobility, public transit, autonomous vehicles, and electric vehicles. Chapters 5 and 6 are more about social sustainability. So in chapter 5, housing affordability and housing diversity. Chapter 6, community health and safety, and food security and sovereignty. And then finally, chapter 7 ends with wind energy, solar energy, other energy generation systems, district energy, and energy efficiency and conservation. So the idea is that we have this menu. Local governments come to the menu, decide which of the 32 chapters they are most interested in and their community is most being impacted by. When you go into any one of the chapters, they have the same structure. And that structure looks like this. I've pulled up here the pedestrian mobility chapter. That structure is set up on a 3x3 grid. I'm just going to pan into it a little bit, the grid. You can see best, better, good along the side. But I think more relevant for most local governments is remove code barriers, create incentives, and fill regulatory gaps. The first one, remove code barriers. The idea here and what in your existing code is stopping you from becoming more sustainable. So if we're in the pedestrian mobility chapter, what in the existing code is stopping you from increasing pedestrian mobility and safety? The second, create incentives. How do we incentivize homeowners and developers to take a variety of actions to increase pedestrian mobility? And then finally, fill regulatory gaps. What will we sort of draw as an absolute minimum as a community for purposes of pedestrian mobility? I also want to point out here this remove code barriers. This whole structure that we have for the Sustainable Development Code was created by an iterative process in which a whole host of interdisciplinary folks were providing information on. Important for us was to say that it really doesn't matter what the size of your community is, geographically where you're located, what your political potentially persuasion is, that there's something in this code that's important to you. So when we started that conversation with the menu, what are you facing as a community? So you don't want to talk about climate change for, let's just say hypothetically, well, let's talk about wildfires. Let's talk about flooding, and we can go into that chapter. Then once you decide that this is important for you, then we can talk about removing code barriers. So how, if this is important to you, what in your existing code is really exacerbating the situation for you? So what I want to do now is that we have all these recommendations. There is about between 20 and 40 recommendations per chapter once the code is all built out. But really where the rubber meets the road is each of these recommendations have what's called a brief. I'm going to go into a brief right now. I'm going to go into the Safe Routes brief. These briefs were again drafted with city staff, the idea being that these briefs could be taken into city staff, into council, and provide them with the necessary information they need to adopt this measure, or at least to understand it as quickly as possible. So we're going to go into the Safe Routes brief. So when we go in there, all the briefs look the same in terms of their structure. They begin with an introduction. And the introduction is somewhat about what are safe routes, but it's really about what does an ordinance contain that is focused on safe routes. So what kind of options do we see in ordinances that are out there that are talking about safe routes? Effects. What can we expect as a community if we adopt a safe routes ordinance? And then really the core of our briefs are the examples. This again goes back to that idea about wanting to encourage local governments and make it easy for local governments to get the information they need. We've sort of scoured the research and the landscape of what local governments have passed, and we've identified only enacted ordinances. All of our examples on the Sustainable Development Code are only enacted ordinances. We begin with 2 to 4 examples where we describe in plain language what the ordinance is doing. And we try to stay away from sort of the usual cast of characters like Portland and Seattle, Austin, Boston, San Francisco, New York City. Great cities, no doubt, but not going to convince Chibolo, Texas, for example, that they should take this avenue. So we search for geographical distribution as well as size distribution in our examples. So we have here 2 examples, one from Chibolo, the other from Pima County, Arizona. We describe them in plain language. We provide all the citations, which I'll talk about in a second. And then we provide 4 to 6 what we call additional examples. Here we've identified the ordinance, and then we provide a parenthetical briefly describing it. Very important for each of our examples, both the examples and the additional examples, we provide a link to the actual ordinance. But what we've done is that we've used a third party called PermaCC. And you can see we've captured it on PermaCC here. What that means is that this language for the ordinance is now sort of embedded. And we know if this one here is from North Las Vegas. If North Las Vegas goes out and changes or amends their code, it will obviously change for them. But this particular code and this link will not die for us. Now, if we find out that they've amended it, we would certainly alter our brief. But what we found based on our discussions with local governments is they weren't so much concerned with the precedential value. I mean, they weren't so concerned that North Las Vegas did X, Y, and Z, but they really wanted the language. And so this way, they're able to crib that language. We have it locked in, and we're not concerned about potentially having dead links or losing the language. I also mentioned at the very beginning, there's 2 ways to search the site. We went through this not sure where to begin avenue down here in the sort of lower left, but the other way is through a word search. A word search site on the Sustainable Development Code site goes through all the briefs, and it pulls out where that particular word has been used. So here I searched drought for this example, and it pulled up all the briefs where drought was listed. So recycled water irrigation systems for new developments, water efficient landscaping, wastewater activities, and it goes on from there, and it allows then the viewer to go in and search the various briefs and look at them. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of hone in a little bit more on some of the chapters. I'm going to walk through the green infrastructure, flooding and drought chapter, a little bit more detail. There's a ton of information in all these chapters, so it's hard to do it too deep of a dive. I'll also touch upon the climate change and then also touch upon social equity in a chapter as well. But as I said on this slide here, the Sustainable Development Code has a narrow focus with a broad coverage. And you'll see that, I think, as we walk through these examples. And what we mean by that is our narrow focus is specifically on the development code and the development process, an ordinance that have been enacted as part of that. But within that, we have broad coverage in that we're looking at the development code and process from a number of different angles, whether it's housing affordability or climate change or wind energy, pedestrian mobility, bicycle mobility, all those chapters that we talked about before. So I'm going to go in here, as I said, to low impact development, green infrastructure for flooding and droughts. And there's many ways to think about this chapter and the things that local governments around the country are doing on these issues. I have on the screen here, though, 4. And these are 4 that we find embedded in the Sustainable Development Code low impact development chapter. Protecting existing green space, growing green space, so maybe more for our flooding communities, but also there's some xeriscaping stuff in there for some of the drier communities. And then water capture and water wasting activities. So let's start with protecting existing green space. local governments across the country are kind of thinking about this issue of protecting their existing green space and all the sort of plethora of benefits they provide, many of which I mentioned before in the discussion of ecosystem services, this idea of purification of air and water, climate mitigation, flood mitigation, all sorts of physical and psychological benefits as well. But there's two ways that we're kind of seeing this come across local governments in ordinance, and that is one is by area and the other is by planting. So in terms of by area, we're seeing local governments set back to protect sensitive habitat areas. Fort Collins, Colorado is a good example of this one. Parking maximums or elimination of parking, as Hartford, Connecticut did. Vegetation protection areas. This is where we're saying over here is a really important vegetation or a particular species, or potentially it's an important area because it provides flooding protection for us. And so we don't want to allow construction in there, or we want to allow very minimal construction in there. And we're seeing those areas protected by natural area, meaning we're identifying an important ridge or something like that. By species, we're identifying a particular native species, as was done in Thurston County on the screen. We're also seeing a really interesting way to adopt this, and this is by floating zones. So this is where a local government will say, we know we have a lot of important vegetation area to protect. Let's draft up the zone, and then we'll place it as we grow as a community in thinking about what we want to protect. Cluster conservation subdivisions in rural and urban areas. This is another thing we're seeing local governments doing. This is the idea, let's say that if we have a 100-acre subdivision, the community will say, you can build X amount of development of housing units, but they have to be clustered down here in 5 or 7 or 8 acres. The rest of it has to be open. Purchase land development rights. This is where we're seeing local governments purchase some development rights that developers may have in order to conserve them. So protecting green space by area. As I mentioned, the second way to protect green space is by planting. Here we're seeing water efficient landscaping. So doing an incentive base like out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, or a requirement like in Tucson. They're requiring the drought resistant vegetation for new developments with some exceptions. So they're actually requiring certain vegetation in Tucson. Removal of exotic vegetation, planting native vegetation, so make sure that developers and homeowners are actively planting native vegetation when they're regrowing after development. Native trees and removal of invasive trees, Union Springs, Alabama. So these last two slides that I just talked about, they were all about sort of looking at the existing coverage and green coverage that we have in a jurisdiction and protecting that. But there are others that are going beyond that, and they're looking to actively grow or have a positive impact on the green space available in the jurisdiction. And this is where we're seeing a whole bunch of really interesting ways to address this issue, beginning with tree canopy cover. Almost every local government across the country, or most local governments across the country, have a tree mitigation ordinance. They often look like something such as this. If you cut down a tree 12 inches in diameter at breast height, it has to be replaced with an equivalent 12 inches at breast height. And that can be 4 3-inch or 4 3-inch trees, not equivalent. But nonetheless, local governments are going way beyond that. Take, for example, Ventura County, California, requiring developers to plant 10 protected trees for each protected tree removed during development. Similarly, Baltimore, Maryland has afforestation requirements, saying to some commercial and residential properties, if you come to the site and the site has, let's say, 10% canopy, if you want to develop, you have to increase it to whatever is in the statute. I think it's something along the lines of 15% canopy cover. So you actually have to afforest the site. Open space impact fees, green roofing. So instead of having just a typical roofing, asphalt or shingle or something that is impervious, allowing permeable surface such that the water can be absorbed in it. Last one on this growing green spaces is pervious cover minimums and incentives. So here, local governments are saying no longer can you just simply put in interior roadways or driveways. Here, now you have to have a certain percentage, like Tybee Island, 50% of the site cover has to be pervious surfaces. Two other ways that we talked about that I mentioned. One is water capture. And water capture we can think of in two different ways as well, and that's rain harvesting. So actually capturing this water, and we see some really interesting things here. The first one on the screen out of Carborough, North Carolina, prohibiting homeowners associations from allowing landowners to have either rain barrels and a whole host of other important sustainability measures such as solar collectors and clotheslines. Requiring implementation of these, though. Santa Fe, Flagstaff, Orlando, and Tucson, the ordinances on your screen as well, are requiring certain rain harvesting measures to be taken. In addition to water capture rain harvesting, we also have recycled water ordinances coming to the fore in many local governments. So Austin, Texas is an example of recycled water irrigation systems for new developments. It requires new commercial development to have reclaimed water connections. In addition, we're seeing a lot of these recycled water systems for more specific uses like car washes. Now, that's what we have out of Arvada. Then the final one here that I'll talk about in the low impact development arena, and particularly for drought areas, are water wasting activities. Take a look at these. Weatherford, Texas. It's a misdemeanor to allow water to flow into any street, road, or highway. The others have fines and also potentially cutting off of the water when there's water wasting activities. So some very significant measures being taken by local governments recognizing water wasting activities. So that's a quick breeze through the low impact development, but much of the information, all of that information you can find on the Sustainable Development Code, but really that just touches the surface of what you can find in the low impact development chapter. I'm going to go into the climate change chapter here, and I want to look at three specific things. I say here on the slide, 4 categories of local climate mitigation. The fourth one is just maintenance of the solar panels. And so I'm not going to dive deep into that one. But the 3 that I want to just kind of quickly point out when you go into the climate change chapter, you'll see that you can break them out in a number of different ways. One is increasing renewable energy production. The second, increasing efficiency and reducing energy demand. And then finally, increasing sinks. So on the first one, if we go to the climate change chapter, and I just have on your screen a screenshot of the chart for the climate change chapter, I've highlighted just some of the measures that are increasing renewable energy production. And I like to think of it this way because I think that usually when we think about local governments and energy, we think of it in a very limited way. Typically maybe efficiency. But local governments are taking a much more active role around climate change and around energy production. So here I've highlighted some of these bullets here, site and solar orientation. So making sure that when a developer constructs something new in the jurisdiction, it is ready for, it's solar ready essentially. Zero net energy buildings. This is even going further, where in some jurisdictions they're requiring the either house or commercial property to be net zero in terms of its energy use. So producing as much on the site as it's using. Limit solar restrictions in homeowners associations and covenants. This is the idea that we're not going to allow homeowners associations to restrict the use of solar. It's that important to the community. Solar ready construction. This is kind of a nice tag team with solar site orientation, where we make sure, one, that the building is rather properly oriented on the site. But then number 2, in the solar ready construction, the construction itself is there so that the solar panels can just simply be capped in. The electrical is in place. Some others, property assessed clean energy programs, some of you may be familiar with, but solar energy systems and wind turbines by right. So removing these kind of obstacles that are already in the code. Height and setbacks to encourage renewables. Again, removing the obstacles that are stopping us or not allowing individuals to put solar panels on their house or their commercial property. So one way to think about the climate change chapter is increasing renewable energy production. Another way to think about it is increasing efficiency and reducing energy demand. And again, I've just highlighted a couple here: energy benchmarking, auditing, and upgrading. So requiring mostly commercial properties to do energy audits on the building and then going forward with actually making improvements on those. Maximum size single-family residence. So instead of allowing a jurisdiction to say a minimum size lot here minimum size house rather here is 4,000 square feet, which obviously begins to segregate the society, requiring them to have a maximum size on it. Allowing, down here in the lower left, allowing tiny homes and compact living spaces. Two that are very important to us as we work through coronavirus today: mixed use zoning and live work units. Accessory dwelling units, so allowing accessory dwelling units. Many codes across the country prohibit accessory dwelling units in residential areas. And then finally, district heating and cooling zones. More to be said on increasing efficiency and reducing demand, but let me go to the last one, which is increasing sinks. So another way to think about climate change mitigation at the local level is increasing sinks. There's a lot of overlap with what we talked about with the flooding chapter. You can see here tree canopy cover, vegetation protection areas, native trees and removal of trees, open space impact fees, and so on. When we bring that vegetation into the jurisdiction, we're able to, if situated correctly, take advantage of flood control measures, alleviate stormwater runoff to the jurisdiction, dropping costs in that sense, but also have those serve as sinks. The last chapter I'm just going to quickly just highlight really is the community health and safety chapter. This is chapter 6.1. We are working through chapter 6.1 over the course of the next year. And over the course of the next couple months, we'll be wrapping up 6.2, which is the food security and sovereignty chapter. We're working on that chapter with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems from Vermont Law School. And it's going to be a fantastic chapter and should be wrapped up by mid-August at the latest. But keep abreast of our work, and which I'll tell you how to do in just a moment, and we'll let you know when that's wrapped up. But here are some really important measures when we talk about social equity. Create safe routes to make sure kids can get to school safely, make sure individuals can walk to and from work, to or from public transit safely. Another one, grocery store development and recognize food deserts. Again, making sure that we are bringing food, healthy food, to all areas across the jurisdiction. Just very quickly, some next steps for us at the Sustainable Development Code. We are going to continue to build out the SDC chapters. We are about 50% fully built out right now. We are going to launch the Food Security and Sovereignty chapter, as I mentioned, later in this summer. We are also going to be launching soon the Autonomous Vehicle and Electric Vehicles chapter and Historic Preservation. In addition to drafting out these chapters, we're working towards implementation and expanding our implementation tools. We want to start doing more workshops, working hands-on with local governments across the country on working through their development code, identifying what in there are the obstacles we can begin to remove. We want to hold more webinars to work through these issues in a very concrete way, as well as videos. Very important for us, we want to have a give and take or continue our give and take with local governments. We want to find out what local governments and communities are doing. So we want to have a wiki-like dialogue with communities. At the bottom of our homepage, you can sign up for our newsletter. Our newsletter is pretty minimal in the sense that we have it once or twice a month. Every month, we do what's called our top 10 list. And this is a top 10 of all the recommendations across the site that have been viewed that month the most. So the communities out there that are exploring the Sustainable Development Code, what are they looking at? And we provide that top 10 list. That comes out every month. And then every other month or so, we also provide a mid-month update on what ordinances and recommendations have been updated to the code. You can get that, again, signing up for our newsletter at the bottom of our homepage. That wraps up my presentation. My contact information is down here on the screen. I very much look forward to the Q&A and from hearing from you if you have questions after the Q&A. Thank you again to Jenny and the ELC. Again, I look forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Rosenbloom. First question is, you mentioned that in deciding which municipalities to focus on in developing the code, that you've sort of avoided looking at places like Portland and Seattle, that have a reputation for kind of being early adopters with more progressive policies. I wondered, what kind of municipalities are expressing interest, and are there any common themes in terms of, is it really mostly more progressive locations, or is there pushback from concerns from an economic standpoint from smaller municipalities? What's been your experience in terms of the reception of these ideas?
Yeah, these are great questions and raise really important issues for the Sustainable Development Code. So what's interesting about the feedback that we're getting in the communities that we're working with is that they are across the board. And I think that the reason for that is that we have been very conscious from the very beginning to make sure that we are getting this information to individuals in an efficient and effective manner and in a way that kind of depolarizes any potential polarizing issue. And, let me just repeat the kind of 3 steps that we've taken on that. One was the menu, the 32 items, the 32 subchapters. So it's really, again, saying to you as a community, if you don't want to talk about wildlife or you don't want to talk about climate change, we don't have to. Let's talk about drought, right? You're experiencing drought, or you're experiencing wildfires or steep slopes and mudslides. So we can talk about those issues. That's one. Number 2, removing code barriers. This is kind of like the low-hanging fruit, but it's also an issue that I think is really important, that once we say this is the issue we're focusing on, let's say wildfires, that we can then talk about how to mitigate that by removing code barriers. And then the third is that peer pressure. I think by staying away from cities like Seattle and Portland, that we're able to kind of put a peer pressure on that works to other local governments, saying, oh, I see our colleague over there was also a mid-sized city or a mid to small-sized city of 50,000 people is also doing that. So I think that's been really important for the success of the Sustainable Development Code. I will note 2 other things. One, sometimes Seattle and Portland, Austin, and others, they're the only ones doing something. And so some of the stuff on the code site, you'll see those are the ones we end up citing, because what they've done is that important that we want to get it out there, and then we'll continue to update it. That's one of the things I didn't mention, is that once we get the Sustainable Development Code fully built out, we will be updating 10 chapters every year. So each chapter will be on a 3-year update. And then the last thing that was mentioned by the last question was cost-benefit analysis. Undoubtedly, yes, we get a lot of questions about cost relevant to this. So in the effects section, we really try to scour the research to see who has done an analysis of this particular issue or this particular ordinance. Let's detail it. Let's provide the information to local governments. We are not trying to hide the ball here. If there is a cost that's associated with this, you'll see it in our briefs. Because again, we want to be as honest as possible, but we think that these are really good recommendations, which is why we have them up there. Last point on the cost-benefit analysis is that we are going forward, hopefully soon, with an enhanced project where we are reaching out to each local government that we cite to ask them, tell us about your experience.
Great, thank you. Next question. Residents of municipalities and cities especially are reacting to the death of George Floyd and ways that they can, personally make a difference in their communities. And what is your advice for people who want to make a difference in the place where they live when it comes to land use and racial impacts?
That's also a great question. This is a huge issue that we are actually kind of working through right now with the Sustainable Development Code. We have kicked around the idea of putting together a specific list on this exact topic, because from our perspective, it's across the board, meaning that if you look at the development code from soup to nuts, you're likely to find issues that are impacting inequality. And so we can talk about things that are as sort of broad reaching as exclusionary zoning. And obviously exclusionary zoning explicitly is prohibited in most areas. But what we're finding is more of an implicit way, sort of an implicit bias in these, where we're finding that maybe we're not prohibiting grocery stores in a particular area, but we are making it either fiscally impossible to build what is required in that area, given the constraints of the height limitations or the floor area limitations, or we're prohibiting it in other kinds of ways. And so one is as broad as the use question. But then we can get even more specific, where we can talk about this idea of tiny homes, or we can talk about allowing accessory dwelling units. So looking at ways in which we are not prohibiting people from moving from one area to another, we are not segregating particular areas. Again, this is a big, long conversation that has to happen. But if you keep abreast of the work that we'll do with the Sustainable Development Code, we are going to get out a list of these, as well as hopefully some type of program on this as well.
And if you're an interested citizen and you're not an employee of a municipality, what can an interested citizen do to try and move their municipality forward? What power do they have to make a difference?
Yeah, this is also a great question. And also I should note, this is a question that we confront a lot, right? Because what we do is we put out the information, and one of the areas that we're looking to go towards, which is really what this question is asking, is how do we get things implemented? So if we say that this is a great idea, well, what do we do with it? Of course, the sort of the elephant in the room is vote. Identify the people who are important to your concerns and vote based on those concerns. But I also think that it's really important at the local level to think about coalitions and building coalitions and putting pressure on individuals based on a coalition. And a coalition can be any relevant people in the jurisdiction. And so, I think those are just generally two ways to think about this. But implementation is a critical part of thinking about how we're going to move forward.
Great, thank you. And a lot of the students at Vermont Law School come to school with an interest in sort of classic environmental law, trees and birds, and not all of them certainly, but can you speak a little bit about what the career opportunities are in the field that you work in terms of local government and environmental and land use law at that level?
Yes. First, trees and birds are awesome. So we don't want to discount trees and birds, which are also important to land use as well. But I think that in many ways, and I don't want to talk about this in a disparaging way, but I think certainly a colleague of mine and I used to talk about it like this, and that's that he really taught the core environmental law classes, environmental law, natural resources. And these are kind of some of the reasons why individuals come to law school. But we used to talk about that, and he used to agree that that was really like the old school environmental law, sort of the classic way in which we think about this. But things are evolving, and we're finding that land use is very much environmental law, and it's very much environmental justice, and it's very much climate justice. And so, in terms of land use itself, and there are other areas that I'll mention in just a moment, but in terms of land use itself, there are a significant amount of jobs both as counsel for local governments, whether it's in-house in a big city, let's say like New York City, which has hundreds of lawyers, or the outhouse for many local governments. They hire out their attorney help. And so being a land use attorney for local governments, but also being a land use attorney for community groups, being a land use attorney for neighborhood groups, being a land use attorney for developers. Right, you can do great work working for a developer. Right, we're going to need housing. Right, the current state of housing, as I mentioned earlier, and infrastructure is dilapidated. So we're going to need development. Well, let's do it in a way that is more sustainable and more resilient and more equitable. So if we have attorneys working with individuals looking at those key issues, I think that will benefit in the long run as well. The other point that I just wanted to make with that is I think that what we see with land use kind of making inroads in careers that are considered, I would consider environmental law, but aren't your traditional federal environmental law, is we see other areas that are like that as well. And so corporate social responsibility, for example, transportation, very much related to land use, is a big area of growth as well. Sustainability generally, sustainable development, a sustainability officer in a corporation or at a local government.
Great, thank you. And I would just add to that for folks that are looking to build some of those skills a little bit, we've got a transportation law class we're offering this summer for the first time. And That's also available to non-degree students. So that's a great opportunity to check out. Okay, with that, we'll need to wrap up so Professor Rosenbloom can get to class. Thank you so much for that talk, and thank you all for joining us today. Our next Hot Topics talk will take place on June 16th. So mark your calendars, and we hope you can join us then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.